I see it going right across my deck here now. I did not. 3 hooks were right up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is good too, Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything. Over.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner. I am one of your hosts here today, and I will be joined right now by Taylor. How's it going?
Pretty good. What are we recording on a Wednesday now? It's been weird ever since I've worked first shift. Like, we record all various different days.
We do.
But it's good. It's good. Work was good. How are you?
Yeah, we've kind of shifted to a roughly 3 to 4 episodes per month rather than our old militant once a week episode recording schedule. But it's supposed to be fun. So
right.
What have you been up to since we recorded last?
What have I done?
And you've got to talk at double speed because we have so much to do.
I know, right?
This is 15 pages of notes.
I saw that. Let's see here. We saw The Fall Guy this weekend. It was Emily Blunt, Ryan Gosling. That's pretty good, actually. I mean, it's just one of those, just enjoy it, don't think too hard, and just enjoy some good action sequences. I think that they're both pretty good actors, so...
Bit of a Ryan Gosling, I don't want to say renaissance, because I don't think he ever really dropped off as an actor, but I think a wider range of people are starting to appreciate him as an actor, because he's really good.
This movie felt like it could have been put out in 2014, but I mean that in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of a no strings attached fun movie. Other than that, I finished The Wide, Wide Sea by Hampton Sides. I've been to the Big Island recently. It was really interesting to read the detailed accounts of what happened there. And kind of just hearing how it all unfolded, and a series of minor escalations and misunderstandings lead to a pretty big historical event happening. So that was a really good book. I like Hampton Sides quite a bit. By
unfolded, of course, you mean the skull fragments of James Cook.
Yes, and some of his Marines. It was really weird that one of the places we ate breakfast at 3 or 4 times when we were there literally overlooks the bay. You just look down into where all that happened. As I ate my chorizo omelet, just like Captain Cook would have wanted. Since I finished that, I started The Demon of Unrest by Erik Larson. Both of these books are new releases, I believe. So,
The Demon of Unrest, that is Josie at 4:30 in the morning when she wants to eat.
This one focuses on the months between Lincoln's election and the start of the official start of the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
This is a really interesting time. It's interesting hearing and reading how unserious some of the people are about anything. It's a reminder that, as weird as it may be right now, it's really not that different. There's always been the same sort of characters have always been around.
Yeah, I mean, I always try to think back of putting things in context. You saw it a lot with when Trump was in office, but it happens all the time of this is an unprecedented thing. And it's not really. I mean, a guy beat a guy to death almost with a cane on the Senate floor. That's weird stuff has happened.
Yeah, there's all sorts of weird things of officers realizing that they're switching sides with other officers who they realize aren't, and they've gone to school together or they're married into each other's families. No, it's been way weirder in the past. So it's very interesting. It's a good book, though. I think Erik Larson writes really, really good narrative nonfiction.
Of his, I've read the Lusitania one, and then he wrote The Devil in the White City too, right?
Uh-huh.
I read that one.
I like how he writes characters, basically. He jumps from character to character. And then the last thing I have here is I started Peaky Blinders last night.
Nice.
I think I might have started it before, but I also might be mixing that up with Boardwalk Empire.
There's especially, and I think it's season 2 or 3, there's kind of a plot point where there is almost a crossover. They could have done a universe crossover.
A crossover episode. It's really good. The first episode was really good. I'm not going to lie. I had seen the one scene before, the kind of climax of the first episode. I had seen that on TikTok, but I hadn't seen how that resolves. So I was still surprised in the end.
I think I never watched the last season of Peaky Blinders. I should watch that.
It's good. It's a fun one so far. So I will keep that going. What about you? What have you been up to?
Continuing to read the book Conspiracy to Murder the Rwandan genocide.
Mm-hmm.
I think I mentioned it in the last episode. It is by Linda Melvern. I think I called her Laura in the last episode. That's a good follow-up to Africa's World War, just because this focuses specifically on the Rwandan genocide, which I'd never read explicitly about before, and it's really terrifying in the speed with which the Rwandan genocide happens.
Mm-hmm.
How everything is like, the plans are very clearly, this is why one where there's no debating what this was, because the planning, the documentation, the ordering of the weapons, the dispersing of the weapons, it's so clear, and it has this sense of inevitability, like when you're reading the build up to it. It's really, really scary.
Yeah, that's not one I know a lot about, but it's probably not as documented as it should be, as just to like how awful that was.
Yeah, the extent to which, Western powers are involved also. France, I mean, is sort of the big European force behind the Hutu-led government that's in power during the genocide. So yeah, that's probably got about 50 pages left of that. I also started listening in earnest to the Dirty Sexy History podcasts with Jessica Kale.
Mm-hmm.
We've interacted with Jessica on Twitter a few times here and there. And there's just so many podcasts out there that I occasionally just have to make a point of sitting down and listening to a new one. It's phenomenal. Just covers a broad range of stuff. Brothels and same-sex relationships in the Victorian era. And all those kinds of things where you kind of maybe assume that this is a modern construction, but it's like, yeah, we've always been doing stuff like this.
Yeah, I think that's always interesting reading some of the history stuff, even in that book that I'm reading now about the beginnings of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. There's a lot more there than one would expect if you just read like mainstream history. And it's like written down. Like, it's not like it's someone interpreting it. Like, no, it's written down.
Speaking of something that has always been present,
the Ottoman Empire.
In my life for the past month or so, the Ottoman Empire and the Holy League. Quick recap here of parts 1 and 2. Seems like forever ago that we recorded part 1. Part 1, we looked at the expansion of the Ottoman Empire through the early to mid 16th century and ended with the Battle of Preveza, where the Ottoman fleet inflicted a defeat on the forces of the Holy League organized by Pope Paul III. Part 2, we briefly covered the unsuccessful Ottoman siege of Malta. We'll be expanding on that in, I think, what'll be a $5 bonus this month. We continued through the war against Venice for the island of Cyprus, where we saw the city of Nicosia fall to the Ottomans under Lala Mustafa Pasha, who then advanced on the port of Famagusta. And that's where we find ourselves here today. We mentioned the delays in organizing the Holy League fleet, which had now turned back for their respective home ports as the siege of Famagusta got underway, beginning on September 17th, 1570. So with Nicosia fallen, the fleet realizes that they're not going to achieve the objective that they had. Roger Crowley sets the scene here at the time for Venice in Empires of the Sea.
Rain fell bleakly on the Venetian lagoon during the winter of 1570 to 1571. The weather was wretched, the price of grain high, the fleet in tatters. There was still typhus in the galleys, and the ship's priests, fearful of contagion, were leaving the men to die unconfessed. The war was hurting Venice badly. Money was short. But the Republic dared not stand down her fleet, for fear the men would simply melt away. The ignominious fall of Nicosia seemed to mark another chapter in the unhalted decline of the Republic's fortunes. Now the fate of Famagusta hung finely in the balance.
We mentioned in the last episode that Nicosia was a heavily modernized fortress. If it had been manned with a full contingent of professional soldiers, it should have held out for a long time. That wasn't the case. They didn't have nearly enough people, and it fell probably faster than you would expect a city like that to fall.
This is just like what happened in Charleston Harbor.
So the defense of Famagusta would be overseen by civil governor Marcantonio Bragadin.
I refuse to believe that's a real name.
Sometimes his name is written Bragadino, which might just be the standard Italian compared to the Venetian dialect. And the condottiero Astore Baglione, a far more capable soldier than the ill-fated Lord Lieutenant of Nicosia, Niccolo Dandolo. We've got Bragadin and Baglione, the killer bees here.
The third one is actually Butker Harrison.
Harrison Butker. Yes.
Noble Catholic soldier.
I think he would have maybe had some things in common with some of the people present at the siege of Famagusta.
I think he would have. I would go for the Ottomans against the Kansas City Chiefs, I want to be clear. Prior to that even, I would have.
The Ottomans would be like, this mascot is pretty racist, right?
Even they're like, I don't know.
Yeah, they were very cosmopolitan. That wouldn't have flown.
Do you all have to do the chop? Do you have to do that? The chant?
So even though
there's like a 50% chance that someone sends a bad review in now because we dared to say that the Kansas City Chiefs is kind of racist.
Kind of a little bit racist. However, the defenses themselves are the problem at Famagusta. They're pretty lacking in comparison with all the fancy Tres Italienne fortifications at Nicosia. Famagusta had only one really modern defensive bastion, with the remainder of the defenses being leftovers from the medieval period. So long before they would have needed to stand up to anything like the artillery that the Turks could bring to bear.
I think that's something you don't always realize when reading through history stuff is like the difference between 1270 and 1570 doesn't always seem like there's a lot of difference, but there's a massive difference with things like this.
We talked about it in our bonus episode for the Armada about the counterfactuals of if the Army of Flanders can land in London or can land in England. And we talked about how most places in England, they had no reason to have updated fortifications. They weren't being besieged like they had been in the medieval era. And kind of the same thing here. These just hadn't been updated.
Got to keep building your walls and civilization.
Yeah, you got to keep leveling up the tech tree. On January 26th of the new year, so 1571, a Venetian relief force from Crete was able to reach Famagusta, depositing an additional 1,300 to 1,700 soldiers for the defense of the city. Sailing in late January, this was an unexpected risk. No one expects you to sail at this time in the Mediterranean. There's only a token Ottoman force remaining to blockade the city. This is also right around, I believe, the beginning of Ramadan. So that also is probably a factor in Ottoman preparations. Seeing these fat, juicy transports, the Ottoman galleys pounced on what they expected to be easy prey, but this brought them directly into Marco Quirini's ambush. Marco Quirini being one of Venice's real star commanders. The troops are deposited safely ashore, and Quirini was able to conduct raids along the Cyprus coast for several weeks, actually, before returning to Crete. It'll come up later in the actual battle portion. Crete, at this point, is also controlled by Venice, so anything coming from Crete is Venetian.
Okay.
The Ottoman commander responsible for the guard galley contingent was beheaded, leaving a job vacancy that would be filled by one Mehmed Sirocco, the Bey of Alexandria.
I'm not going to lie, I would probably not have gone back to my boss after that happened.
You can't just go back to the office the next
would have
day.
Probably just wandered away and taken my chances with the other side and be like, hey, y'all want to know some stuff?
Reminds me of the Eurospy ones from Kill James Bond, we do not tolerate failure.
Some of those are really funny.
So yes, the Ottoman Empire does not tolerate failure. Or rather, it doesn't tolerate failures that shouldn't be failures.
Right.
We will see Mehmed Sirocco again at Lepanto. He's a pretty big name there. And, he stays on his grind. If you keep grinding, you never know who is going to get beheaded in front of you. So you can fill that position.
It's the grind, chop. That's really what you got to do.
As we see from the Holy League fleet breaking up and returning home at the fall of Nicosia, there's no realistic hope that the Christians will be able to take back Cyprus. However, Famagusta would hold out for more than half of 1571. Even though Lala Mustafa had offered very generous terms of surrender, including even transportation to a Christian territory of the defenders' choosing.
That seems pretty good.
He keeps on making the carrot bigger and bigger. The Ottomans have a big carrot and a big stick. And he is using the carrot. He's trying to use the carrot. So quoting here from Hugh Bicheno, who I don't remember if I quoted him in the previous two episodes. I used his book a lot in this episode. The book is called Crescent and Cross, The Battle of Lepanto, 1571.
When the useless mouths the Cypriot non-combatants were put outside the walls in mid-April, Lala Mustafa could have left them to starve in no man's land. But instead, he had them escorted safely to their villages and made sure those left behind saw how well they were treated.
I think comparing this to another historic example of this, the Battle of Alasia, where Caesar's besieging Vercingetorix in Alasia, and obviously to save on, food rations, they expel anyone who can't fight. And Caesar has built this other wall around Alasia, and rather than bringing them in, he sends them back. He says, and so you have these people just wandering between these walls, just starving to death. That doesn't happen here because the Ottoman Empire, nice guys.
I mean, I guess it kind of shows you they planned on staying because they tend to have that concept of like, well, we just want to be in charge, but we'd rather you be happy about it than fight us.
And they already know that they have the general support of the population. Any area that they've liberated already, that's a good thing for the most part for the Greeks living there. Maybe they can convince some more Greeks inside the city to do the same. So in a previous part of the series, we talked about the accepted norms of Ottoman siege warfare, wherein a quick surrender or even really a respectable defense would result in a fairly decent treatment for the defenders.
Mm-hmm.
Bicheno gives some more detail on this.
Traditionally, a fortress was called upon to capitulate on terms when demonstrably cut off from outside aid, when the saps reached the ditch, and when a practicable breach had been blasted in the walls. A garrison that resisted beyond the latter point was understood to have inflicted unnecessary casualties on the besiegers and could accordingly expect no mercy.
This is like the final minute of a basketball game.
Mm-hmm.
You're down by 20. There's 40 seconds left. You stop fouling. Just let the clock run out.
Right. Yeah.
It's good sportsmanship. The siege ground on through the end of July, with the Ottomans making slow but steady progress, and with fewer than 500 Italian defenders left alive, and most of the Cypriots within the walls dead. Another big difference here. So both sides are trying to learn lessons from the siege of Malta.
Mm-hmm.
The Venetians conduct essentially a completely static defense of Famagusta, and as you see, they just get ground down. Because Cyprus is actually a really productive area. There's lots of food on Cyprus. Malta was a big rock, basically. Mm-hmm. There's nothing to survive on, but Cyprus, they can hold out basically indefinitely. Plus, Cyprus is super close to the Turkish mainland. It's super easy to resupply.
Right.
They can't really wait out the Ottomans this time. On August 1st, 1571, Astore Baglione gave the order for Famagusta to surrender, and the white flag was raised. And even with all that extra trouble, Lala Mustafa seems to have just been relieved that it was over, and he could report back to the Sultan that the job was done. But, in addition to destroying valuable stocks of food, ammunition, and cotton, another fateful decision was made by some combination of Bragadin, Baglione, or other individuals within the city.
It's usually not good when people start making big decisions in times like these.
During Quirini's raids in January, a ship carrying Muslim pilgrims was among those that fell victim to the rampaging Venetian. And there's conflicting stories about who, how many, and where these people were.
Mm-hmm.
But by some accounts, at least, those 50 pilgrims had been held prisoner in Famagusta since that time. So a little content warning here for the next part. We get to see the stick. Content warning for the next couple minutes for torture/execution. Roger Crowley narrates what happened next during the meeting between Bragadin and Lala Mustafa on August 5th.
Mustafa wanted a hostage from among the nobles. Bragadin cursed him angrily. You shan't have a noble. You shan't even have a dog. Angry now, Mustafa asked where the Hajj prisoners were. According to Ali Infendi's account, Bragadin admitted that they had been tortured and killed after the peace treaty had been signed.
Those Muslim captives were not under my personal control. The Venetians and native beys killed them on the day of surrender, and I killed those who were with me.
Then, said the Pasha, you have broken the treaty.
Big dun-dun-dun moment.
I picture that's right when he shoves the knife into him.
Why would you just tell him that?
I'd be like, again,
I don't know what happened.
Why is everyone so honest? I'd be like, I don't know, man. They're probably over there.
This might come back to the fact that the Ottomans it was well known that if you had signed a treaty, the Ottomans would respect the treaty. So maybe thinking he could get away with it, they're not going to kill me because I did this. They're certainly not going to do anything worse than that.
Yeah, I definitely think it was probably what's the worst that's going to happen?
So Baglione and hundreds of other Venetians were executed immediately, and their heads piled up in front of Lala Mustafa's tent. Bragadin, not so lucky. When the others were executed, Bragadin did have his ears and nose cut off, with these wounds, of course, left untreated, until August 17th. So that's a little under 2 weeks after this. After some elaborate ritual humiliation, consisting of marching back and forth in front of the Pasha carrying sacks of dirt, Bragadin was stripped, tied to a column in one of Famagusta's public squares, and flayed alive. If it is any small consolation, he probably did not live through more than the first maybe a minute.
I feel like that ticket to any Christian kingdom you wanted was probably looking decent at that point.
Yeah, he was already in pretty bad shape. Obviously, he's got these untreated wounds. He's probably not being fed or treated very well. So if it helps, maybe he didn't actually feel much of this. From Roger Crowley.
The skin was stuffed with straw, dressed in the commander's crimson robes, and shaded by a red parasol. It was mounted on a cow and paraded through the streets. Later, the hideous dummy was exhibited across the coast of the Levant, and then sent to Salem in Istanbul.
All right.
They really went for it there.
If you just play by the rules, they'll usually treat you pretty nice. But if you torture and murder their prisoners that you promised to give them back.
I mean, again, when you grow up just being ready to shank your brother and all your cousins and stuff, this is probably pretty easy to do to someone you're fighting in a war.
Yeah, probably. It's kind of like we said with the fall of Nicosia, is that Lala Mustafa develops this reputation for cruelty. It's you skin a guy alive and turn him into a scarecrow. That will happen. But at the same time, the only real criticism, I guess, is that you could say it was a bit much. He went a bit overboard here. Of course, probably any reasonable person at this time is going to have Bragadin killed.
Mm-hmm.
All of the extra decoration, maybe that was a bit extreme, we'll say.
But like you said, big carrot, big stick.
If we don't make an example of this guy...
Yeah, right. Then the whole thing kind of falls apart.
Exactly. So, let's talk about the reformation of the Holy League fleet. We mentioned the delays in the organization of the Holy League fleet. Some of these delays were due to issues that were out of the Holy League's hands. Outbreaks of plague. You've also got Ottoman corsairs running all along the coasts in the Mediterranean.
This doesn't sound like a great time to be alive in this part of the world.
No, not really.
1500, being a French peasant in the 1500s would have sucked.
Yeah. But you could always run away to the Ottoman Empire and,
That's true.
Work your way up to be a Grand Vizier. The delays were also spawned from disagreements over the League's objectives. Spain, whose opinion held a lot of weight due to the resources that they commanded, wanted the League to be not only focused on fighting the Turkish infidels, but on Christian heresy as well.
Spain is like the United States in this scenario.
They really do occupy that space, where they kind of dictate what a lot of other people have to do, and they're also providing a lot of the actual muscle behind these.
Mm-hmm. The kind of, we're all allies, but this ally's the shot caller a little bit.
Although surprisingly, we'll see the Pope also wields a lot of power in this scenario. So Spain, like we said, they wanted some help elsewhere also. This is right at the beginning. This is right when the Dutch revolt is starting to pop off, which we will come to know as the 80 Years' War. And if Philip can get guarantees of support in the Low Countries, he's going to be much more enthusiastic about joining the League. Venice, however, would have very little motivation or maybe even ability to help against the Netherlands. For Venice, really, the Turks are everything at the moment. And
yeah, I would imagine that's the more pressing thing.
Like we said before, the Turks are just one of Spain's various concerns. They've got their stuff in the New World, they've got the Netherlands, and yeah, they've got stuff in North Africa, the Mediterranean. Add to these conflicting objectives Pope Pius's pipe dream of recapturing the Holy Land for Christendom.
It's wild that that's still something that we're trying to do.
Both Spain and Venice opposed this. This is the everybody hated that meme. One of Pius V's demands was that the League being formed would be a, quote, permanent crusading institution. It sounds like that's like global war on terror stuff.
It really is, isn't it?
Meaning that none of the participants could withdraw without approval from the others.
Spain and France, two countries that famously get along.
Well, France is not in this.
Oh, that's true. France isn't in this, is it?
The Pope does try to get France involved with this. Any formerly Christian lands recovered would revert to their previous owners. Spain would keep possession of any North African territory taken, with any other spoils of war split among all members equally.
It feels like a good deal for Spain.
Yeah, basically, they're getting a lot of help, and anything in North Africa they get to keep. But arguments over where the League's focus should be were just one of the obstacles. Another was Venice's shaky commitment to a military alliance at all. One of the cardinals present at the negotiations had this to say regarding the Republic.
I have no doubt that if the Sultan should offer these lords some sort of accord, and the League is not quickly settled, they will accept it, even though it means simply surrendering Cyprus to him.
No one trusts Venice here.
It doesn't seem like it.
We come back to the fact that the other Christian rulers, they don't trust Venice, and they shouldn't, really. I mean, it's good policy not to. Throughout the negotiations for forming the Holy League, Venice was also in talks with the Ottomans, specifically with Ottoman Chief Vizier Mehmet Sokollu.
The Chief Vizier had his own ruthless game of power politics to play. He had not wanted the Cyprus War, but now that it was underway, he was determined that his bitter rivals in the Divan, Lala Mustafa and Piale, should not gain military glory at his expense. If he could whittle Famagusta from the Venetians by diplomacy, he could still spike their guns.
The backroom power plays come in here, where you've got it's not just the block of the Ottomans versus the Christians, it's all of the Christians versus each other and all of the Ottomans versus each other, and then all kind of fighting against the other side too.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's so easy to forget when you read, especially older accounts of this kind of stuff, is like, it's not just like this side is the Christians and this side is the Muslims. Like, there's so much more going on than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why it's interesting reading about these, because coinciding somewhat with the early 2000s and the global war on terror, there was a bit of a resurgence in interest in stuff like this, because you've got this epic showdown of Christian versus Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of the marketing material for most of the books around that time really plays into that. Even that Hugh Bicheno, which is a pretty good account, a pretty like academically written account, is called Crescent and Cross, really focusing on the religious aspect.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's a lot of trying to kind of connect those two eras to one another. So throughout this, I do try to use the term Holy League rather than Christian, just because that is not a super realistic description of the forces.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, money played a role in getting Venice to join, as the Pope offered to increase papal support for Venice's defenses by 100,000 ducats, provided that they joined the League. There was actually a similar monetary relationship with Spain. We saw that with the Armada, where Pope Sixtus V says, I'll give you buckets and buckets of ducats. As soon as you actually land in England, they're yours. But nothing before that. While, yes, like Spain is obviously the military force here, the Pope has tons of money. Like, obviously, the Catholic Church has always been fairly well off in terms of money, certainly since this time. He's got a lot. He has enough money that he can really tip the scales in negotiations like this.
The Pope is kind of like NATO.
You could look at it that way. Oh, also, by the way, this is Pope Pius V. This is the Pope who issued the original papal bull for the excommunication of Queen Elizabeth, the bull Regnans in Excelsis.
He was a busy fella.
So we have him to thank for this. On the 25th of May, 1571, the Holy League was officially proclaimed at St. Peter's Basilica by Pope Pius V. In command of the Holy League's forces was Don Juan of Austria.
Doesn't sound very Austrian.
It doesn't. This is King Philip of Spain's half-brother. So his illegitimate half-brother.
A bastard, if you will.
A bastard. His mother was... I forget her name. She came up a few times in that biography of Charles V I read, because she was like his favorite mistress. Barbara Blomberg was her name. One of Charles V's favorites. In some English language sources, he's referred to as Don John, which I just think goes weird with Don. It just doesn't sound right.
No, Don John does not sound as fun.
But I think some writers are trying to avoid like the other connotations of Don Juan.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense. I'll call him Don Juan. Philip first proposed Gian Andrea Doria, but this was an absolute non-starter for Venice. Don Juan was very young. He had just turned 24 a few months earlier. And some of these big name sea captains here, these guys are in like their 50s and 60s.
Yeah, it does seem very young.
So they're going to put him in command over some of these guys. This wouldn't actually be the first time in command of a military endeavor, though, for Juan. Don Juan had been appointed General of the Sea 3 years earlier, succeeding the savior of Malta, Garcia de Toledo.
I'm not going to lie, 21 seems young to be the General of the Sea.
A little bit. This is like IDF rules here. You complete basic training and you're already an admiral. Congratulations. We have 40,000 admirals. So in July of that year, 1568, Philip's son Carlos, the Prince of Asturias, died after spending the last 6 months of his life in solitary confinement due to his violent mental instability. Not the first nor the last Habsburg to suffer from issues like that.
Not gonna lie, doesn't seem like a great time to even be a rich person with violent mental instability.
His genetic predisposition to mental health problems, this is likely compounded by a head injury that he suffered in his teens. Not to mention just the very complicated emotional situation he would be in. I mean, he's without his father for large portions of his childhood. He doesn't have, what we would call a normal upbringing.
I would say not.
You never want to hand it to royals, but it's like, he didn't choose to be born into this family. He has a very sad and depressing life.
I feel the same way about him as I do like Princess Anastasia or someone. It's unfortunate that had to happen.
Even before his death, it was clear that he couldn't be allowed to succeed to the positions that his father had held.
Mm-hmm.
Philip, he had been kind of slowly introduced to being a ruler. He had become the Duke of Milan before he, was king of Spain or anything. And they realized they cannot do this with Carlos. Carlos cannot be put in any position of authority. And so because of this, Don Juan's importance increases. Age-wise, he's essentially a son to Philip.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, one of the more disturbing acts of violence exhibited by Carlos in the final months of his life was an attempt to murder Don Juan. I believe he lured Don Juan into his like bed chamber, but one of the palace guards knew what he was going to do, and so he unloaded Carlos's guns.
I feel like that's one of those things with the guards. Like, I never thought I'd actually have to do it, but yeah, today's the day.
I can't like arrest this guy on my own initiative. So like, what can I do so he doesn't hurt himself or others? So yes, he was detained. That was one of the things that prompted his incarceration. So this being the case with, Don Juan is more important than ever. When the Moriscos revolted in 1568, those are, Morisco is a term for culturally or formerly Muslim inhabitants of Spain who have, at least on the surface, converted to Christianity just to be in compliance with the law. So they revolted a couple of times, actually, but this time in 1568, this was the second, what's called the Rebellion of the Alpujarras. It was Don Juan who was given command of the Spanish forces sent to put it down.
Is that near where you went in Spain?
This is like the southeastern coast of Spain.
Okay.
It is there is a wider revolt that happens, but this is the only place where it really holds. The Ottomans are kind of involved with this. There were negotiations for them to lend support to this rebellion, but the rebellion happens like 6 months or a year early. And so they can't really provide any support at the time. So at Lepanto, Don Juan would be the leader on paper, but he would also be surrounded by many more experienced sailors and soldiers. From Hugh Bicheno in Crescent and Cross.
Juan had chafed in nominal command of a fleet run by grandees, who were in no doubt what the king's reaction would be should they permit a hair on his brother's head to be harmed. But his entourage in Alpujarras could not exercise a similar degree of control. Philip was quite explicit in a mild reproof he sent after learning that Juan was doing the rounds of sentries incognito. You must keep to yourself, and I must keep you for greater things. And it is from these that you must learn your professional knowledge.
Don Juan's response to his brother's admonition was to draw a parallel between his own actions and those of their father, the famed soldier emperor Charles V.
At my age and in my position, I see that your Majesty's interest requires that when there is any call to arms or any enterprise, the soldiers should find me in front of them, or at least with them, ready to encourage them to do their duty, and that they should know that I desire to lead them in the name of your Majesty.
An interesting contrast in personalities, but I think also in age. Philip II is 44 at this time, so he's middle-aged, and he's having to exchange with this. It was basically a kid, and this kid wants to be in the action. He wants to fight. He wants to be the leader in the front. Total opposite of what Philip would do. Philip loves to rule the world from his desk. And then also just a note here regarding like the succession. We said that Carlos was removed from the succession. Don Juan became very important. The child who will be Philip III, who actually succeeds Philip II, he won't be born until 1578. So he's not in the picture yet.
So like Don Juan is
he very well could be the only option.
Yeah.
So you can understand Philip's hesitance to want him out here fighting. He needs to get experience, but he doesn't need to put himself in danger.
That's why we don't see Kamala Harris all that often.
Don Juan did not just fall out of the coconut tree. He has to understand that he exists within the context of all that has gone before him. So in February 1570, though, Don Juan was nearly killed, attempting to rally fleeing Spanish troops, taking an arquebus ball to the helmet, while some of the entourage were wounded or killed. So he does get shot in the head, but he just happens to be wearing a helmet.
That's not a good thing to your potential, next king to be doing.
Philip was unsurprisingly and understandably not happy when he heard about this. Quoting from Philip's letter, as quoted in Bicheno,
"You keep so ill your promise not to place yourself in jeopardy. You ought not to vex me thus, and to lower the credit of my arms, and add to that of our enemies, so greatly as would be the case if they were to shed a drop of your blood. I therefore distinctly order you, and will take it very ill if you disobey my order, not to do so any more, but to remain in the place which befits one who has the charge of this business and my brother. For everyone ought to do his own duty, and not the general soldiers, nor the soldier the generals."
Now, I know this is not Philip II telling someone to stand back and let other people do their job.
I know that ain't who I think it is.
A little bit of irony, if we remember from Philip, he's a micromanager to the extreme. He wants to do everything for everyone and make every decision. So a little bit rich coming from him.
That would be rough to hear.
I'm sure Don Juan probably responded the same way. I think all this is helpful to build the backstory of who Don Juan of Austria is at the time of the Lepanto campaign and the relationship he had with his brother. As the Holy League fleet is slowly getting itself together, the Ottomans are raiding more or less unchecked from the Aegean to the Adriatic, with a total of about 250 galleys, plus up to 100 smaller fighting ships. Naval activities, sometimes in coordination with land forces, to put down rebellions in parts of Greece and the Balkans. The Ottoman fleet and its associated corsairs were extremely active through the first 3 quarters of 1571, something that will likely play a role in the upcoming battle that they don't know yet is coming. By August, Ottoman ships had pulled back out from the Adriatic to avoid being cut off by Holy League forces at the Strait of Otranto. Strait of Otranto is that really narrow gap between Italy and the Balkans.
Yeah, I'm having to pull up a map right now so I can visualize it.
After raiding the Venetian-held island of Corfu, the Ottoman fleet was assembled at Lepanto and held a council of war to discuss their next actions. Included in this council was the aforementioned Mehmed Sirocco, the most senior captain present. Also there were Hassan Pasha, son of the famed Barbarossa, and Mehmet Bey, son of Salih Reis, who had commanded the Ottoman right wing at Preveza. This is a family business, being a corsair. Mehmed Sirocco noted the exhaustion of large portions of the fleet due to the already long campaigning season. Quoting here from Bicheno.
This gave rise to an exchange between Hassan and Mehmet. After Mehmet supported Sirocco's cautious assessment, Hassan interjected that Salah, bravest of the brave, would have been ashamed to see his son shrink from battle. Mehmet replied to the effect that it was a shame Hassan had not inherited his father's intelligence.
Everybody's sniping at each other.
No one is happy.
There's a lot of good barbs in this, like internally, like the Ottomans against each other and the Holy League. There's a lot of cattiness back and forth. And again, like this, you'll see this in a bit with the Holy League, is both sides kind of see this on the table, this big clash, and it's making everyone antsy and a little bit grumpy sometimes. They just want to get there and fight the guys we're supposed to fight. This Ottoman Council, this is less a debate over whether to fight, but rather how, in terms of strategy and formations.
Mm-hmm.
They are, at Lepanto. They're in this little bay. So if the Holy League fleet comes to them, there's not really much of a choice whether or not they can give battle. Quoting again from Crescent and Cross.
The fleet that arrived at Lepanto on 20 September was depleted by men lost in action. The transports, heavily burdened with loot and about 8,000 valuable captives, were sent to Navarino, escorted by 60 warships under Ulik Ali. Intelligence about this, but not of the escort's prompt return, reached the Holy League fleet at Giscardo on 5 October, along with news of the fall of Famagusta and the cruel massacre of the Venetian garrison, together tipping the scales in favor of seeking battle.
News does not travel very fast at this time, and they finally find out of what has happened at Famagusta. So especially among the Venetian contingent, anyone who maybe didn't want to fight is pretty motivated to do so now.
Mm-hmm.
With Famagusta fallen now, any of the original motivation that was still hanging on is gone. Like they're not going to liberate Cyprus with this fleet. But with the fleet at Corfu, scouts brought word that the Ottoman fleet had retired to Lepanto. Lepanto is, I guess it's the Italian approximation for this. The Greek name for it, because it's in Greece, is Nafpaktos. And then you'll see the Ottoman, the Turkish sources refer to this as Inabakti, all referring to the same place. This is in the Gulf of Patras. So this is southeast of where the Holy League fleet is at Corfu, on the west coast of Greece. Over the final days of September 1571, the Holy League fleet made its way south from Corfu, reaching Kefalonia on October 4th. From Kefalonia, they sailed east towards the Curzalari Islands outside the Gulf of Patras, seeking the Ottoman fleet. Around dawn, on October 7th, Holy League lookouts spotted a number of sails to the east. Signal guns were fired, and the two fleets began the final plunge into the long-awaited battle. Long-awaited for them, long-awaited for us and our listeners.
This is like when you're watching a war movie as a kid and they finally get to the shooting.
The fleets lined up opposite one another at the mouth of the Gulf, both choosing to engage. For the Holy League fleet, this was a confrontation with the actual enemy that could not come soon enough. Just days before, tensions between Habsburg troops and Venetian sailors had nearly exploded into a full-scale battle. So there was an officer in Spain's Lombardy tercio, Captain Muzio Alticozzi di Cortona, in charge of Spanish troops on board the Cretan, so read Venetian, galley Armed Man. There had been numerous arguments and brawls between the two groups, leading Venetian commander Sebastiano Venier to dispatch his first mate and an ensign to the ship to calm things down. Do you want to guess what happened to those two guys?
Did they do the 300 kick and kick them off the boat?
Sort of. These two were promptly thrown overboard by Alticozzi and his troops. I don't know if they died. None of the sources mention that. I think maybe they were just more embarrassed than anything. So this nearly spins out of control when another member of the tercio, Paolo Sforza, drew his galley, which is a galley that belongs to Doria. He draws it up next to Venier's ship, and he offers to fix the problem. I don't exactly know what that's supposed to mean. I don't know if he is offering to go in and put down the mutineers or what, but whatever he means by that, Venier, the Venetian commander, responds,
"By the blood of Christ, take no such action, unless you wish me to sink your galley and all on board. I will bring these dogs to heel."
The rebellious troops surrendered under the threat of Venier's heavy guns. Alticozzi and 3 of his compatriots were hanged from the rigging of Venier's flagship.
Oh.
Problem: Venier is not his commander and has no authority over him. This is actually an interesting thing that will come up in the battle, but a bit confusing with the different designations. You see what are, technically Spanish troops under Spanish command, but they're Italian. These are Italian troops raised in Italy, but they're from Spanish domains in Italy. So obviously you add in the Italian regional rivalries also. A lot of these Italians have a lot of reason to hate Venice, just for Italian reasons, Venier hangs these mutineers. This nearly broke up the Holy League fleet.
I can imagine there's some hurt feelings here.
This is a Spanish officer being summarily executed by a Venetian. Ultimately, the guy who would have authority over this guy is Don Juan, as the ranking Spanish guy there. Doria suggested that they return to Messina and leave Venice to clean up her own mess. Doria, and really, he's Genoese, any excuse he can to leave Venice in the lurch, he'll probably do it.
Right.
This idea was supported by several other commanders. One guy who opposed it, Alvaro de Bazan, the Marquis of Santa Cruz. Our friend from the Armada episode, well, the first Armada episode. He was of the opinion that we came all this way, we got through all this other stuff, why would we turn around? They're literally right here.
We're going to fight some Turks.
Let's just do it, and we'll sort the other stuff out after. Marcantonio Colonna came up with a compromise. Venier obviously couldn't remain as a member of the Senior Advisory Council. He needed to be punished somehow. But Venice couldn't be abandoned entirely. So Venier was replaced in his primary role by Agostino Barbarigo, a Venetian quartermaster general of the sea.
That feels like a made-up rank.
I don't actually know what that position entailed. So Venier is swapped out for Barbarigo, and honestly, despite the fact that this is a punishment, it actually will work out in Venier's favor. Based on, keep Barbarigo in mind. The Holy League fleet was arrayed with its back to the open sea, bows facing east. The Holy League left wing, so this is on the north and closest to the shore, was commanded by the aforementioned Venetian Agostino Barbarigo. He's got 53 or 54 galleys. Most of these are Venetian. And a note here when talking about like the nationality of these ships, a lot of them are not owned by the state or the nation they come from. A lot of these are personally owned by the admirals involved. So Gian-Andrea Doria personally owns a lot of the ships that are involved here. And he has something of a reputation for reticence to actually engage in combat. And one of the explanations for that is he doesn't want to damage his ships.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to damage your property, right?
He can use those for more profitable things than fighting. And so a couple of Doria's galleys are on this left wing, one of which is La Marquesa. Aboard La Marquesa was a naval infantryman of no particular importance at this time named Miguel de Cervantes, who we might know as the author of Don Quixote.
Interesting.
So he is present at the Battle of Lepanto.
I did not know that.
We'll see him a bit later. Just so I don't forget, I'll drop it here. So obviously Cervantes does survive the Battle of Lepanto because he's got a book to write. He does actually get captured by the Ottomans later, and he has to serve as a galley slave. But not after Lepanto. It's a few years later. So in the center of the Holy League, you've got about 60 galleys under command of Don Juan. Don Juan is on his flagship, La Real, and he had overall command of the fleet, on paper. On the same day that Don Juan was appointed commander, Philip also sent a letter to Luis de Requesens y Zuniga, giving him paternal authority over Juan.
Your attendance upon Don Juan, as much in matters regarding his command as his person and everything else, is of very great importance, and directed towards what is for us the main end. It being understood that upon it depends not only on the good performance and proceeding of said command and office, but also for the good direction and progress of his life and actions that we so greatly share.
That was all one sentence, by the way.
Yeah, reading some of these things, like the period had not been invented. There's so many commas and things.
Certainly not for Philip. Philip had a very long-winded style.
Yeah, it's like just say what you want to say.
I think in a way maybe that exhibits his self-absorption. Like he expects people to listen until he's done talking. You get a period when I say you do. Also among the council of advisors assigned to Don Juan were Gian-Andrea Doria, Alvaro de Bazan, who I'll just call Santa Cruz after this point. At this point, Santa Cruz is Captain General of the fleet from Naples. We've got the Sicilian Captain General Juan de Cardona, and we've got Ascanio della Cornia, who had fought in the relief of Malta. Don Juan was under explicit orders from Philip not to engage the enemy without the unanimous consent of Requesens, Doria, and Santa Cruz. So if all these guys say it's time to fight, go for it. Maybe smart on Philip's part because, like, Doria is a tough cuss. It is hard to convince him to actually engage in battle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a pretty good gauge.
If he's agreeing to it, say, okay, yeah, it's time to fight. Along with Don Juan in the center was the leader of the papal forces, Marc Antonio Colonna. He was the one who had come up with that compromise earlier. And here we also have Sebastiano Venier, the now demoted Venetian captain. And Venier is pretty old at this point. He's in like his mid-70s, I think, at this point. But still obviously a fiery individual. Venier had also been one of the commanders most resistant to serving under the young and inexperienced Don Juan. He's like 50 years older than Don Juan. And
that's a weird dynamic.
And he's very experienced at sea, and he's being told that he is, subordinate to this kid. This was to the point where he did have at least one verbal altercation with Don Juan. And again, it was Venier's first maiden ensign who had been tossed overboard by the Spanish troops earlier. When they had that argument, I believe it was Marc Antonio Colonna who had to step in and calm things down. So we can kind of see Colonna as one of the pieces of glue that really holds this thing together. He seems to get along with most people, and he's able to calm down these situations.
He's like the guy that can talk to everybody, actually. And
yeah, like Don Juan will get like the laurels, but I think Colonna on a personal level, is probably equally responsible because he does a lot to hold this together. The Knights of Malta, the Hospitallers, were represented by 3 galleys in the center formation under Pietro Giustiniani. The Genoese, Gian Andrea Doria, he commanded the right wing of the Holy League. He had about 50 galleys. And an interesting part here, out in front of the Holy League's line, were 4 Venetian galleasses, which we should remember from the Armada episodes. They're these big, lumbering, but potentially very dangerous vessels, combining the oar and sail power in addition to a very large number of guns. Those were the ones in the Armada episodes where we said, these are the ones that are really scaring the English fleet, the ones that they're really trying to keep their distance from, because they could really tear them apart. Quoting here from Bicheno,
"The most likely credit for the decision to have all the galleasses towed a quarter of a mile ahead of the battle line must lie with Don Juan, probably in consultation with their commander, Francisco Dudo. It was, however, a basic principle throughout the 16th century to fight behind fieldworks or to create detached strongpoints ahead of their main line."
So that's interesting. You hear a lot how naval battle in the 1500s is just a land battle that happens to be on floating wooden platforms. And this is another example of how those same strategies are making their way onto the water here. You're just trying to do all the same stuff you would do on land. It's just a bit more precarious.
Yeah, it's interesting that sinking the other ship isn't like necessarily the goal. Like, you'll take it if you can, but capturing the ship or just killing everyone on board is really what you're trying to do.
Or taking them prisoner. Commanding the reserve, so this is stationed behind the main battle line, is our old friend, the Marquis of Santa Cruz. He's got 28 vessels. These are mostly Venetian and Neapolitan galleys. He's another one who probably does not get as much credit as he should. He does a really good job commanding the reserve. He actually very actively participates in the battle from here.
I feel like usually that reserve commander, you'll like never know his name if he does his job correctly, because it just nothing bad happens.
He definitely steps in at some key moments here. Switching sides to the Ottomans. The more numerous Ottoman fleet was arranged largely in a double line, allowing the front to easily expand as needed. Bicheno compares this to a set of sliding doors. It can expand or contract relatively easily. The right wing, so this is north, closest to the shore, opposite Agostino Barbarigo's Venetian ships. This wing was commanded by our old friend Mehmed Sirocco. He was the bey, the governor of Alexandria.
All of our friends are coming together in one place.
They are. This is the series finale, just like a TV show. He's got about 60 ships. These are mostly galleys, but with a couple of smaller galleots as well. If you're reading about Lepanto, sometimes you see Sirocco referred to as Shuluch, which is just, he's named after the wind, the Mediterranean wind. The Sirocco is where his name comes from. And the Turkish version of his name is from the same word. So it's just 2 versions of the same name.
Interesting.
All of the Ottomans involved are usually named some combination of like Mehmed Ali Pasha. The Ottoman left was commanded by a fascinating figure, Uluç Ali, who we've mentioned a few times in this episode already. He's the Beyler Bey, the Governor General of Algiers. But Uluç Ali is an adopted name.
Interesting.
Because he was born Giovanni Dionigi Galeni.
So he's the goat herder guy in 300.
As a teenager in Calabria, he had been captured in one of Barbarossa's raids and forced to serve as an Ottoman galley slave. Not a great life in the galleys, but after converting to Islam, he sailed under Turgut and he climbed the ranks until he got to where he was, in command of the Ottoman left wing at Lepanto.
I feel like that's a pretty good example of if you just play ball with the Ottomans, like life can be decent.
He's not even the only Italian. I didn't really write about him because I couldn't find a ton of great sources. But there's another Ottoman figure named Kara Hoja. That's not his name. I believe that just means the black priest. He was apparently a defrocked Dominican priest who became an Ottoman corsair.
Interesting.
He's actually involved with scouting the Holy League fleet because he is Italian. He speaks fluent Italian. He can literally sail into these Holy League ports, look around, ask questions, and sail back. Uluç Ali, who's also sometimes referred to as Okiali, he'd been responsible for a lot of that previously mentioned Ottoman raiding in the Mediterranean. He was another one of these big names that, a lot of the Christian Mediterranean was scared of. He had about 90 vessels under his command, and about 2/3 of those were galleys, and the rest galleots. In the center, and in overall command, was Muizinzade Ali Pasha, Kapitan Pasha, or Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, on his flagship, Sultana.
Not that Sultana.
I will say, bad things happen to the Sultana, but it doesn't explode. Also, the Ottoman term Kapitan Pasha, I think Kapitan is just like a loan word. I think it's just from the word captain.
Interesting.
I could be mistaken. So with Ali Pasha, he's got a similar contingent to the left wing, split about 60-30 in favor of galleys. Crowley has this to say about the two opposing commanders.
Where Don Juan was born into the royalty of Europe, Ali was the son of the poor. His father called people to prayers in the old Ottoman capital of Edirne, 140 miles west of Istanbul. Through the meritocratic system of Ottoman preferment, Ali had risen to the position of fourth vizier, and now to the exalted position of Kapitan Pasha, admiral of the Sultan's fleet, the post once held by the great Barbarossa.
While they had reached their respective positions through very different routes, the opposing commanders had something in common.
Crucially, neither man possessed much experience on sea warfare. It was not coincidental that the contest for the Mediterranean had been marked by a singular absence of large-scale sea battles. Even Preveza had been a little more than a glancing blow.
So this is an interesting thing. It mentions how neither of them have a lot of experience in naval warfare, but not a lot of people do.
Yeah.
In terms of an actual pitched battle, you have people who are good at raiding back and forth, but the only people who've really been in a sea battle are people who were at Preveza, and those people, if they're still alive, are really old. So caution was the order of the day with any potential naval encounter. The risk is just way too high. As with any battle, a lot of it is a roll of the dice.
I feel like that, we see that play out though in World War I and World War II with the German fleets.
Mm-hmm.
In a very similar way of everyone wants a big navy and then no one wants to see their navy.
No one wants to use it, yeah. But we see this later with the Armada. Philip tells them very explicitly they're not to engage the English unless they are attacked first, and there's nothing they can do about it. They're not supposed to go out of their way to fight anybody at sea. So in all, we're looking at an estimated 208 ships in the Holy League fleet, carrying about 62,000 potential combatants. So this includes soldiers, crew, and oarsmen who would have been free to fight. About 30,000 of these are professional troops, a mixture of Spanish regulars, around 13,000 German and Italian mercenaries, plus roughly 5,000 soldiers from Venice. But like we saw, even the, quote, Spanish soldiers are probably at least half Italian. That's how Cervantes gets here. He enlists in, I think, one of the Naples tercios is how he gets here. He's not even in a Spanish tercio per se.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting that the nationality stuff almost doesn't matter.
It's very fluid. And like we said, because this is all of these nations, quote unquote, are tied back to their monarch. So you don't have the same fixed, lines.
Mm-hmm.
These could change in a year if the king dies and someone else takes over. So comparing this to the Ottoman forces, consisting of roughly 250 ships and nearly 58,000 potential combatants. Now, what's interesting here is that the overall number of personnel was pretty significantly higher on the Ottoman side, but this included enslaved oarsmen they're not exactly going to give weapons to.
Right.
Although Ali Pasha apparently did offer the slaves on his ships their freedom if they fought for the Ottomans.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if you're going to do it, you might as well be like, hey, there's something in it for you too.
On the Holy League side, you do have captive, enslaved oarsmen, but you also do have things like convicts who, I mean, maybe they're not your most committed hardcore fighters, but they might rather fight for you than the Ottomans. Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So while the Ottomans did have more ships, the Holy League outgunned the Ottomans pretty significantly. They've got over 1,300 medium to heavy guns compared to the Ottoman estimate of 741.
Interesting that they have like that much more.
Here we are.
Are we at the section that says battle?
This is basically the incident
This
portion of this episode. So for anyone who's been like, I thought you guys talked about maritime disasters. I didn't think this was a naval history podcast. Shut up. Like 40,000 people are about to die in the episode. So as we get into the details of the battle, remember that despite this being one of the most famous naval battles in history, a lot of the blow-by-blow accounts that have been constructed are on a best guess basis.
Mm-hmm.
This is an enormous, chaotic battle. It's taking place over pretty big distances, and you've got almost 150,000 people taking part. You've got noise and smoke and fire. Basically, no one who's here has any concept of the whole battle until well after it is over.
Can you imagine having like a drone and being able to watch this like unfold?
It's truly unfathomable, I think, because like you read about these battles on paper, you can see the maps, you can see how they develop. This is a series of dozens of small battles taking place at the same time, occasionally bleeding into one another. Chaos is the best word to describe this battle.
And I'm sure like almost instantly, like you're not going to be able to hear or see anything.
And if you fall over the side, you're probably going to drown. Add that on top of your normal land-based problems. Many of those who fought left no written accounts. I mean, by far, most people who fought never wrote anything about the battle.
I'd be willing to bet that most of the people that fought couldn't write.
First-hand accounts were washed out by, secondary accounts that were published in the decades after, all of these being very highly propagandized. So around noon on the 7th, both sides were more or less in position, with the larger Ottoman fleet advancing on the Holy League. On board the flagships, standards were raised and calls to prayer and absolution were issued. And then the shooting started.
Gotta pray and then go fight.
The Ottoman standard that's used on the flagship here is one that had actually been captured by Suleiman when the Ottomans captured Baghdad during his reign. So it's a banner that has some history to it.
I always like stuff like that. That's like that Confederate battle flag that I think, is it Virginia or Mississippi, asks Minnesota for from time to time. And Minnesota's like, nah, we took this. We're going to keep that.
Come get it. So yes, at this point, this is when the guns start going off.
Like some prehistoric beast, roaring defiance across the disputed pond. A blank charge from the main gun of the Sultana broke the silence to initiate the oddly formal ceremony of challenge and response, with which battles of this period commonly began. La Real answered with a shotted gun. Sultana replied in kind, and the Ottoman fleet surged forward at battle speed, opening to pass on either side of the galleasses.
So I guess I kind of read this as like boxers going to touch gloves.
Uh-huh.
But then one of them actually takes a swing. We saw something similar with the Armada. This is what the English fleet did when they first engaged the Spanish Armada. They sent forth this smaller ship, the Disdain, and they fired one cannonball and then hauled ass back to their own fleet. Kind of the ceremonial kicking off of things here. So as those Ottoman galleys are bypassing the galleasses, they're also getting ripped the off pretty hard.
So basically, are both sides just sailing past each other like broadside?
So no. So like they're sailing directly at each other.
Okay.
There's no broadsiding at this point in history.
Okay.
As any sort of concerted thing. We talked about that in the Mary Rose a bit. She was one of the, and that was, I think, the 1520s, 30s. Mm-hmm. Because most of these are galleys, all of their force is really concentrated just directly forward. Like we saw with the Armada, galleys are not good sea-keeping vessels. They're very long and very narrow, and they have very low freeboard. So they're really just trying to shoot them straight ahead at each other. Not a lot of maneuvering necessarily. 2 or 3 of the Ottoman galleys are destroyed right away. One of them allegedly just broken in half by one shot from a galleass. So this kind of details what the galleass can do and why they are breaking their whole formation around these things. And after those initial salvos, almost immediately, huge portions of the battlefield are clouded with smoke, cutting down even further on any sort of coherent narrative of this battle on any sort of large scale.
Yeah, any first-hand account that is claiming to know anything more than what was going on immediately around them is not telling the truth.
Mm-hmm. And also, this has another effect of reducing the usefulness of the Ottoman archers.
Oh, that's true.
Who significantly outranged any handheld firearms on the Christian side. So both sides have firearms, but the Ottomans, as a fighting force, are still much more reliant on the bow and arrow, which is good because it has a better range than most of these handguns at the time. But if they can't see, they can't hit very much. So by the time that these opposing vessels are close enough to actually see each other, that range advantage is basically nullified.
Yeah, you're inside the range of the bow and arrow at that point.
And actually, interesting thing here, we might have this idea of like a fancified Ottoman vizier kind of sitting on a, I don't know, on a divan watching this all happen. But Moisendzadeh Ali Pasha is actually a renowned archer. He is standing on his flagship, just gunning people down.
I just assumed it was like Xerxes in 300.
He's like a boss in a video game where like you think that, oh, this guy looks soft, and then he reveals that he has some like secret superpower. He's
got a shield and everything.
So the wings of the two formations closed with one another before the respective centers managed to get in contact. Again, all this is happening simultaneously, really, so it's hard to tell one cohesive narrative. But in the north, so this is the Holy League left and the Ottoman right, the lighter, more shallow drafted Ottoman galleys of Mehmed Sirocco, they're able to outflank Barbarigo's formation. Barbarigo is trying to hug the shore as close as possible, thinking that, I can't let them get around me. But they can get a lot closer to shore than he can. So they're actually able to outflank him and cut him off from the shore and turn his flank. Barbarigo's own vessel is actually the one that's able to refuse that full encirclement.
Mm-hmm.
He's facing northwest. He's basically turned around backwards by the time he's able to intercept the Ottomans. His vessel holds them off alone until more support arrives from Venetian galleys, but they're still really outnumbered. And all these galleys end up just jammed together, essentially forming one big fighting platform.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like that, they all kind of link up, and I'm sure you can move from one to the other at this point.
Trying to make it, we mentioned that this was a very loud occasion. Lots of guns going off, shouting, trying to make yourself heard over the din of combat. Barbarigo, he's trying to shout orders. He wants to be heard. He raises the visor of his helmet. He's wearing like a full helm at the time. And of course, as soon as he raises this visor, he gets an arrow to the eye.
It's like something from a movie.
This is a mortal wound. He falls. He's carried below decks to die. So not a great start for the Holy League here. And again, this would have been Sebastiano Venier had he not hanged that guy and made everyone angry. So Barbarigo ends up maybe suffering the consequences of that. Despite the loss of their commander, the Venetian flagship held out against continued attacks until relief arrived under Antonio de Canal, who was wearing basically a 16th century version of a bulletproof vest. He's wearing this quilted suit that's like arrow-proof. I hope it was arrow-proof in the sense that they would like stick to it but not penetrate, because like I can imagine him just looking like a hedgehog by the end of this.
But what if he shot you in the face? What if he shot me in the face?
That's a risk we were willing to take.
This would make a fun Assassin's Creed level.
Also among the relief group were Neapolitan galleys that were very wisely dispatched from the reserve by Santa Cruz. So when I mentioned that Santa Cruz, in a way, contributes to winning this battle, is he sees that left flank is being turned, and he knows that that's going to be bad for the Holy League. He dispatches these galleys from the reserve and kind of saves the day here a little bit. So this effectively blunted the Ottoman attack in the north, and it stands as possibly the big Ottoman error in the battle. Sirocco being closer to shore, he could have basically stayed put as the anchor of the line, because the Ottomans vastly overreach the Holy League out to the open sea. They can curl around and probably just envelop the whole fleet. But things being as they are, now the Holy League left wing can just push into and through the Ottoman line in the north and actually cut them off from a retreat back to Lepanto. This is Uno reverse card.
No, it really is.
Sirocco himself was fished from the sea, already mortally wounded, onto the galley the Trinity, under Giovanni Contarini, where he was mercifully beheaded. That's how it's described. I think he was pretty badly wounded. He probably would have died from his wounds or drowned if he had not been dragged on board.
I guess it's sort of like putting a wounded horse down, right?
Yeah. And here actually is where the downside of fighting close to home territory comes up. The remainder of the Ottoman right wing totally collapsed, with many galleys simply heading for shore and being abandoned by their crews, who just ran off.
It's a lot easier to desert when you are right by where you live.
Although I do have to think this is Greece, so like I'd have to think that Ottoman crew members trying to escape, into some remote Greek village, I can't imagine they were too well received.
I wouldn't think so.
The news of Famagusta was still fresh in the minds of the Venetians, and they really show it here. As the Holy League left wing, which is mostly Venetian, engages in a relentless mop-up action. Some of them even going ashore to pursue Ottomans who had fled their galleys. They're chasing these guys like into the hills.
It's funny.
From the beach. And kind of like we said with the Spanish and the Italians, worth mentioning here that the Venetian label here, it's actually Greeks who are doing much of the legwork here, both rowing and fighting at Lepanto.
It's so interesting that like nationality and citizenship is such a fluid concept at this point.
Guaranteed, like there were ships on both sides of this that were being commanded in Greek, just because of the people involved. So Girolamo Diedo, a Venetian official from Corfu, wrote of the action at the northern end.
In this vast confusion, many of our galleys, especially those nearest the center of the fleet, made a general turning movement towards the left in good order and came to envelop the Turkish ships, which were still putting up a desperate resistance to ours. By this adroit maneuver, they held them enclosed as in a harbor.
As the fighting at the north devolved into this full encirclement and slaughter, our brave young soldier, Miguel de Cervantes, received the arquebus wounds to his left arm and hand that would leave them useless for the rest of his life.
I did not know that about him.
Yeah, he was pretty seriously wounded at Lepanto.
Is that where he found time to write?
And like that being the case, I don't know how useful he was as a galley slave when he was captured by the Ottomans.
I'm sure they found something for him to do.
That's basically the North wrapped up here.
What if he was just the funny guy?
Very possible.
Of like all the slaves. Like he was just the guy that could get a laugh out of everybody. And they're like, yeah, we'll keep you around.
It's extremely possible. Don Quixote de la Mancha was written in like a 1001 Arabian Nights style way to stave off execution. So as the centers came together, the battle still hung in the balance. As the Ottoman flagship Sultana slammed into La Real before a counterattack pushed them off and carried the battle onto the Sultana, where Muezzinzadeh Ali Pasha was killed along with his entire crew after about an hour of fighting. From Roger Crowley.
There are a dozen different accounts of Ali's last moments, according to different degrees of heroism to the Pasha. Most probably, the admiral, an easy target in his bright robes, was felled by an arquebus shot. A Spanish soldier hacked off his head and raised it aloft on a spear.
The descriptions of this are one of the more terrifying aspects of the battle. We mentioned that everyone's trying to fight a land battle on the sea. And so what that means when you have these Spanish tercios involved is once they get on board the decks of these galleys, these long open decks, that means you have a wall of pikemen just advancing down this deck, just sweeping it clean. It's a horrifying way to fight. You either get impaled and trampled or you jump overboard and drown. That's the style of fighting that's going on here.
Yeah, that is pretty surreal. Just to have a land battle on a boat.
It is a pretty interesting. What was that show on the History Channel? Clash of Warriors. It was like different historic warriors versus one another. It'd be like samurai versus Spartan warrior.
I think it was called like Top Warrior or something.
Here you have the tercios versus the janissaries fighting on the decks of these ships. And like we said there, Ali Pasha, he's heavily involved in the fighting. Don Juan He's slightly less involved in the fighting, but he is still in the thick of it. He even receives a wound, I think, to the ankle. He gets like stabbed in the ankle, which again, probably too close of a call for Philip to be happy with. I'm sure Don Juan loved it when he realized at the end of the battle that he actually did get wounded. Philip probably less so. The southern end of the line is where one of the more debated events of the battle takes place. Our old buddy, Gianandrea Doria.
Yeah, what's he up to?
From a long line of sometimes accused cowards, but somehow still famous names in naval history. Doria was in command of the Holy League Right, but rather than holding his position that he was assigned to, he continued to take his wing further south, leaving an ever-growing gap between the right wing and the center.
Gaps aren't good.
He moved so far that Don Juan actually dispatched a ship to summon him back. Say, hey, where you going, buddy? Battle's over here. Across from him was Uluc Ali, our formerly Italian corsair.
Mm-hmm.
He continued moving south as well. So Doria's explanation for this after the fact, because everyone is asking, what's up here, man? His explanation, and this is a logical explanation, is that he's trying to block the Turks from totally outflanking him. They have a much longer line of battle.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like a tackle in football. You kind of have to pick, do I block the outside guy or the inside guy? In a naval battle, you don't want to get outflanked, so he chooses the outside guy, basically. According to him, that's his explanation. At Uluc Ali's signal, he was apparently very good at this. Part of his squadron broke off very quickly back to the right, and makes for that gaping hole in the Holy League's front. It's about 1,000 yards wide, is the description here. He's making dead for the center, and he's going to get there faster than Doria can catch up to him.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, what this reminds me of is the Battle of Lake Erie, the disputed actions of Jesse Elliott, hanging back very far from battle. He has a good explanation for it, but maybe not everyone believes that's what he was actually trying to do.
Right.
Some people accuse Doria of trying to stay out of the battle and maybe even leave himself in a good position to escape. But we'll never know. Because in the center, Uluc Ali falls upon some of the stragglers from Doria's line, as well as 3 galleys flying the banner of the Knights of St. John, the Hospitallers, the Knights of Malta. So if there was anyone that the Turks wanted to take out in this battle, it was probably them. And Uluc Ali does a pretty good job of that, devastating these galleys with arrow fire. The Maltese flagship, along with their commander, Pietro Giustiniani, are both captured. I believe Giustiniani was the last one left alive on his vessel. But just as Uluc Ali was making good headway, the Ottoman center was collapsing, as we just described.
The wily corsair certainly had no intention of dying in a lost cause. He cut his tow rope on the Maltese flagship, leaving the wounded Giustiniani to tell the tale, but prudently taking its standard as a trophy. Steering to the north with 14 galleys, he slipped off.
It's been real, guys.
Yeah, gotta go.
Over the roughly 4 hours that the Battle of Lepanto lasted, an estimated 40,000 men died.
That's a wild number.
It is insane how many people died. You were waiting for the maritime disaster. How's 40,000? That's an estimate. There's no way to verify if that's higher or lower. About 60% of those dead are from the Ottoman fleet. This is a very famous victory, but it's by no means like a smashing victory in terms of numbers. It's a horrific casualty count on both sides. Comparing to most naval clashes at the time are nothing more than skirmishes. And 40,000 dead is just crazy numbers. Girolamo Diedo wrote,
"What has happened was so strange and took on so many different aspects. It's as if men were extracted from their own bodies and transported to another world."
The Ottoman chronicler Pachevi wrote,
"I saw the wretched place where the battle took place myself. There has never been such a disastrous war in an Islamic land, nor in all the seas of the world since Noah created ships."
Is that something that Noah's credited with?
I was actually going to ask you. I didn't realize that that was ever something we thought. And it might be a different thing in the Islamic tradition also. That's true. Yeah, that's interesting.
I do think it'd be funny if, like, in the story of the Ark, God is like, build me a boat. And Noah's like, what is that? Not just build me a bigger than normal version. First, I need to explain to you what this is. Accounts of the battle I used in terms of like long form accounts, Roger Crowley's Empires of the Sea, Hugh Bicheno's Crescent and Cross, in terms of the battle itself. And then some of Andrew Hess's articles were really good also. So getting into the aftermath here. Pope Pius was elated at the news of the victory. Justifiably, you could say. This was kind of his baby.
Yeah, he put a lot of this together.
He had put this together. He had organized the whole thing. Philip was, in typical fashion, more muted. A witness recounted.
He didn't show any excitement, change his expression, or show any trace of feeling. His expression was the same as it had been before, and it remained like that until they finished singing Vespers.
All right, so he takes this in stride. He probably would have responded the same way if it had been a devastating loss. And while the victory was celebrated throughout Europe, even in England, they're celebrating this. Even in, the now Lutheran parts of Europe, this is a big deal. Maybe not in France, I'm guessing.
Yeah, like, I don't imagine, like, an English person is not, like, upset that the Ottomans are, got their shit kicked for a second.
Yeah. So that being the case, though, now in retrospect, we look at this as a historical turning point. Much like the Armada, it didn't really seem that way at the time. There's no major collapse of Ottoman power in the Mediterranean. Ottoman Grand Vizier Mehmet Sokollu asserted after the disastrous showing at Lepanto,
the Ottoman state is so powerful. If an order was issued to cast anchors from silver, to make rigging from silk, and to cut sails from satin, it could be carried out for the entire fleet.
Sokollu also reportedly boasted to a Venetian ambassador, Turkey only lost a beard, which grows back, whereas Venice lost an arm, which does not. We kind of maybe have forgotten about the original thing here. The whole point of this was fighting over Cyprus, and Venice has definitively lost Cyprus, even before the Battle of Lepanto happened.
Yeah, this feels sort of like a Dunkirk situation almost.
To support Sokollu's ideas there, the year after Lepanto, 1572, the Ottomans are able to put another force of 200 ships out to sea.
No long-term effects here, I guess.
Yeah, like if you read about the fleet, like it's not as, the ships aren't as good. A lot of them are made from very like green timber. Obviously, they've lost a lot of experienced sailors and soldiers at Lepanto, so it's probably not the same quality fleet. But the fact that they can just come back out and put another one of these out to sea, probably pretty depressing if you are
right.
Christian Europe. Philip, in classic fashion, as we said, not overly enthused by the news of the victory. Quoting here from Crescent and Cross, Hugh Bicheno gives us the following explanation.
His brother had not merely gambled the fleet, but also his dynastically invaluable life on the roll of the dice that any battle must be. Furthermore, he had taken this appalling risk after the end of the safe campaigning season, when it was impossible to follow up the victory to secure its fruits. An outcome Philip fairly attributed to his brother's appetite for glory.
So we see some of the reasons that Philip would have been maybe less enthused by this. He's getting the news, hey, we had this great victory, and his first response is, what do you mean victory? Why were you fighting?
It's funny that he is just not excited about that.
Seems like you don't really like being king very much, Philip. The motivation for the assembly of this version of the Holy League had been the relief of Cyprus. There's really not any ability to follow up after Lepanto. Quoting here from Svetopluk Suchek, who I quoted in some previous episodes.
Renewed bickering among the allies resulted in a desultory cruise of the League's fleet off of the Peloponnesus. A half-hearted attempt to seize Navarino, or just a watering mission. Mutual avoidance of a clash with the Turkish fleet under Kilik Ali Pasha, and premature return of the allies to their respective home ports. The campaign of 1572 was a draw, which, however, could be considered a Turkish success, considering the Christian triumph and the Muslim disaster the year before.
And then also in that quote, you mentioned Kilich Ali Pasha. That is Uluç Ali from Lepanto.
Okay.
The name Uluç means like a foreigner, a barbarian. So He's basically given this new name Kilich Ali, which Kilich means sword. So kind of as an acknowledgement of his services, even though he kind of runs away, but after everything is decided. And so because a lot of the people above him are dead, he rises up the ranks. Contemporary Ottoman historian Mustafa Ali had this to say in his assessment of the Ottoman Navy's 1572 campaign.
The Imperial fleet left its harbor in the capital, and consisting of 150 victory-bound ships, was confronted by enemy ships off of Navarino, but neither side dared to attack the other.
The abject infidels, because they were satisfied with the gains of the previous year, the warriors of Islam, because, remembering the grave defeat they had suffered in that year, gave no sign of mustering courage in their hearts to take revenge.
Especially the notable admiral, who had survived the terrible disaster, aware of the fact that the soldiers lacked courage for a battle, found a limited displays of strength and steadfastness preferable.
This is a new fleet, a lot of new sailors. Kilich Ali is one of the few who would have actually known what a pitched naval battle was like, and probably never wanted to do it again. The war would continue actually until Venice and the Ottomans signed a peace treaty in March 1573.
Wow.
Ceding control of Cyprus to the Turks. There's not a ton of fighting that goes on after Lepanto.
Yeah, like one of those intermittent...
It's like how the American Revolutionary War technically goes on after Yorktown. Not a lot happens.
According to Hamilton, that's pretty much it.
So this peace treaty that the Venetians signed with the Turks, you kind of wouldn't know that the Ottomans suffered this big naval defeat. There's a substantial war indemnity paid to the Ottomans in the form of 300,000 ducats. They give up control of Cyprus. There's more to this in the Soucek article, but it doesn't actually end up having the effect that the Ottomans think. Like, they ostensibly are taking Cyprus to stop piracy, and it doesn't really work. And in some ways it gets worse. Pirate's going to pirate.
Right.
The Ottomans can't patrol the entire coast of Cyprus. There's still going to be these pirate havens and dens where they're going to operate out of. So it doesn't really do anything to solve that problem. In 1573, Don Juan, he successfully captured the North African port of Tunis. It had changed hands numerous times, like I mentioned in the last episode. However, it was retaken the following year, this time more definitively, with even the fortress of La Goleta falling to the Turks.
So much back and forth in all of these.
I could be wrong. I believe it was Uluç/Kilich Ali who captured Tunis this time. This really entrenched the Ottoman threat in the Western Mediterranean, but Spain found itself with other concerns that would force its gaze elsewhere. Like we said, to the Netherlands and the rising tide of the Dutch revolt. There's a lot of action in the Low Countries in the early 1570s. You've got cities being captured, recaptured, besieged, sacked, all of that stuff. Very few pitched battles during the Dutch revolt. In 1573, the governor of the Netherlands, the Duke of Alba, resigned, and he was replaced by Luis de Requesens. In the Armada series, we alluded to the several bankruptcies of the Spanish Empire under Philip II. One of those comes in 1575. Those creditors do eventually come calling, after you've been spending all this money on these ships and these armies. This led to a lack of pay for the Army of Flanders.
Armies generally like to get paid.
What does the Army of Flanders do when they don't get paid?
I would mutiny if I was the Army of Flanders.
They not only mutiny, but they go and find their money, or some replacement for their money. This results in the infamous Spanish Fury, where they're just kind of running wild in the major cities of the Netherlands, Antwerp most famously. But yeah, they just kind of go on a looting spree and say, we'll continue doing this until you pay us. The downside of not paying your vicious, heavily armed, well-trained, experienced army. So around this time, you do also get the Portuguese invasion of Morocco in 1578. They're also trying to take some of that sweet North African territory.
I mean, it's right there. How can you say no?
The King of Portugal dies in that battle. That leads to ultimately the succession crisis in Portugal, where, like we said in the Armada episode, Philip graciously steps in to fill that gap, so he can also be King of Portugal. And interesting thing there is that consolidates Spain's hold in Iberia. It takes some problems off the table. There's an Ottoman-Spanish truce in 1580. So the Iberian Union has happened. The Ottomans are no longer a threat to Spain. That leaves Spain able to look elsewhere, like England.
They just can't help themselves.
This is when the plans start coming in of what are we going to do about England? Now that those other things are dealt with, Spain can focus on other problems. Now it's Protestantism that becomes the major focus for Philip rather than the Ottoman Empire. So in terms of his legacy, I mean, it's obviously remembered as this huge Christian victory. If you read more like conservative Christian sources, you'll see it as this God's victory over the infidel, despite the fact that it doesn't have a lot of material impact at the time. It's not until much, much later that we kind of decide, hey, this was a turning point in history. So quoting here from J.H. Elliott in Imperial Spain, 1469 to 1716.
The spectacular victory of the Christian forces at Lepanto in 1571 was to epitomize for contemporaries all that was most glorious in the crusade against Islam. It was an eternal source of pride to those who, like Miguel de Cervantes, had fought in the battle and could show the scar of their wounds, and of a grateful wonder to the millions who saw in it a divine deliverance of Christendom from the power of the oppressor.
So like we said before, Lepanto was a formative experience for a lot of the officers who are later going to be involved in the Armada campaign. We talked about Cervantes. He's not involved with the Armada, but his experiences at Lepanto do shape him, and so that shapes ultimately the history of Spain, the history of European culture in many ways. You know, we get a lot of the literary things from Cervantes. The Marquis of Santa Cruz, this is another thing he adds to his resume. He can rightly say, hey, I saved the day at Lepanto, and that puts him in position, to be the first commander of the Armada before he dies of typhus and can't actually command it. Another one from the Armada series, Alessandro Farnese, who's not yet the Duke of Parma, but he will be. He's present at the battle, and he's Philip's nephew. By the time of the Armada, 17 years later, he is the Duke of Parma and Governor General of the Netherlands. But at Lepanto, Farnese he's commanding his father's troops, about 300 to 400 men. So this is, again, a formative experience for him, adding to his reputation. He develops his reputation as a really fearsome soldier, and part of this starts from Lepanto.
I definitely feel like one of the things is like it is that transitional point, like you said, where Spain decides to be like, well, what about England?
Yeah, they can kind of look outward to other things. And also, I mean, Lepanto is usually depicted as a turning point for the Ottoman Empire. In a way, you could look at it as a turning point for Spain as well.
Mm-hmm.
Spain still has a good bit of time as the big dog in Europe. But, as you get into the 1600s, 30 Years' War, that's kind of the time when Spain is going to suffer some huge setbacks on land in Europe, and France is going to eclipse her as the big power on the continent. So yeah, I mean, not just the Ottomans, you could look at it as a turning point for Spain as well.
Mm-hmm. Spain
kind of starts her long decline right around this time, after Philip II. So yeah, I think it's obviously, I think it's an interesting battle. We talked about it for like 4 hours.
Yeah, there's quite a bit on. This is rivaling the Lusitania.
So this is still my birthday, technically, I guess, a month later.
Right.
The original impetus for this episode. I mean, we've talked a lot about it. Check out some of those books. I'll post all the sources in the show notes. A lot more reading to do, obviously. Only scratched the surface in this series. And then we'll also be doing that bonus episode on the Siege of Malta. That'll just be one episode. We will fit it all into one episode. That being the case, yeah, thank you if you've made it with us this far to the end of the Battle of Lepanto. And yeah, we look forward to getting to probably back to some more traditional style episodes, but also continuing to play with, kind of stuff we want to cover on the show.